The history of Canada covers the period from the arrival of Paleo-Indians thousands of years ago to the present day. Canada has been inhabited for millennia by distinctive groups of Aboriginal peoples with distinct trade networks, spiritual beliefs, and styles of social organization. Some of these civilizations had long faded by the time of the first European arrivals and have been discovered through archaeological investigations. Various treaties and laws have been enacted between European settlers and the Aboriginal populations. Beginning in the late 15th century, French and British expeditions explored, and later settled, along the Atlantic coast. France ceded nearly all of its colonies in North America to Britain in 1763 after the 7 Years' War. In 1867, with the union of 3 British North American colonies through Confederation, Canada was formed as a federal dominion of 4 provinces. This began an accretion of provinces and territories and a process of increasing autonomy from the British Empire, which became official with the Statute of Westminster of 1931 and completed in the Canada Act of 1982, which severed the vestiges of legal dependence on the British Parliament. Over centuries, elements of Aboriginal, French, British and more recent immigrant customs have combined to form a Canadian culture. Canadian culture has also been strongly influenced by its linguistic, geographic and economic neighbor, the United States. Since the conclusion of the Second World War, Canadians have supported multilateralism abroad and socio-economic development domestically. Canada currently consists of 10 provinces and 3 territories and is governed as a parliamentary democracy and a constitutional monarchy with Queen Elizabeth II as its head of state. Pre-colonization. Aboriginal peoples' archaeological and Aboriginal genetic evidence indicate that North and South America were the last continents into which humans migrated. During the Wisconsin glaciation 50,000–17,000 years ago, falling sea levels allowed people to move across the Bering Land Bridge from Siberia into northwest North America. At that point, they were blocked by the Laurentide ice sheet that covered most of Canada, confining them to Alaska and the Yukon for thousands of years. The exact dates and routes of the peopling of the Americas are the subject of an ongoing debate. By 16,000 years ago, the glacial melt allowed people to move by land south and east out of Beringia and into Canada. The Queen Charlotte Islands, Old Crow Flats, and Bluefish Caves contain some of the earliest Paleo-Indian archaeological sites in Canada. Ice Age hunter-gatherers of this period left lithic flake-fluted stone tools and the remains of large butchered mammals. The North American climate stabilized around 8000 BCE. Climatic conditions were similar to modern patterns. However, the receding glacial ice sheet still covered large portions of the land, creating lakes of meltwater. Most population groups during the Archaic periods were still highly mobile hunter-gatherers. However, individual groups started to focus on resources available to them locally. Thus, with the passage of time, there is a pattern of increasing regional generalization. The Woodland cultural period dates from about 2000 BCE to 1000 CE and includes the Ontario, Quebec, and Maritime regions. The introduction of pottery distinguishes the Woodland culture from the previous Archaic stage inhabitants. The Laurentian-related people of Ontario manufactured the oldest pottery excavated to date in Canada. The Hopewell tradition is an Aboriginal culture that flourished along American rivers from 300 BCE to 500 CE. At its greatest extent, the Hopewell exchange system connected cultures and societies to the peoples on the Canadian shores of Lake Ontario. Canadian expression of the Hopewellian peoples encompasses the Point Peninsula, Saugeen, and Laurel complexes. The eastern woodland areas of what became Canada were home to the Algonquin and Iroquois peoples. The Algonquin language is believed to have originated in the western plateau of Idaho at the plains of Montana and moved eastward, eventually extending all the way from Hudson Bay to what is today Nova Scotia in the east and as far south as the Tidewater region of Virginia. Speakers of Eastern Algonquin languages included the Mi'kmaq and Abenaki of the maritime region of Canada and likely the extinct Bahu'u'Cow, Newfoundland, the Ojibwa and other Anishinaabe speakers of the Central Algonquin languages retain an oral tradition of having moved to the lands around the western and central Great Lakes from the sea, likely the East Coast. According to oral tradition, the Ojibwa formed the Council of Three Fires in 796 CE with the Odawa and the Potawatomi. The Iroquois were scented from at least 1000 CE in northern New York, but their influence extended into what is now southern Ontario and the Montreal area of modern Quebec. The Iroquois Confederacy, according to oral tradition, was formed in 1142 CE. On the Great Plains, the Cree Nihilor depended on the vast herds of bison to supply food and many of their other needs. To the northwest were the peoples of the Nardine languages, which include the Athapascan-speaking peoples and the Tlingite, who lived on the islands of southern Alaska and northern British Columbia. The Nardine language group is believed to be linked to the Yeniseian languages of Siberia. The Dene of the Western Arctic may represent a distinct wave of migration from Asia to North America. The interior of British Columbia was home to the Salishan language groups such as the Shuswap, Okanagan and Southern Athabascan language groups, primarily the Dakel and the Silkuin. The inlets and valleys of the British Columbia coast sheltered large, distinctive populations, such as the Haida, Kwakwaka'wakw and New Charnel, sustained by the region's abundant salmon and shellfish. These peoples developed complex cultures dependent on the western red cedar that included wooden houses, seagoing whaling and war canoes and elaborately carved potlatch items and totem poles. In the Arctic archipelago, the distinctive Paleo-Eskimos known as Dorset peoples, whose culture has been traced back to around 500 BCE, were replaced by the ancestors of today's Inuit by 1500 CE. This transition is supported by archaeological records and Inuit mythology that tells of having driven off the Tunite or first inhabitants. Inuit traditional laws are anthropologically different from Western law. Customary law was non-existent in Inuit society before the introduction of the Canadian legal system. European contact. There are reports of contact made before the 1492 voyages of Christopher Columbus and the Age of Discovery between First Nations, Inuit and those from other continents. The Norse, who had settled Greenland and Iceland, arrived around the year 1000 and built a small settlement at Lanzo Meadows at the northernmost tip of Newfoundland. Lanzo Meadows is also notable for its connection with the attempted colony of Vinland established by Leif Erikson around the same period, or, more broadly, with Norse exploration of the Americas. Under letters patent from King Henry VII, John Cabot became the first European known to have landed in Canada after the time of the Vikings. Records indicate that on the 24th of June 1497 he sighted land at a northern location believed to be somewhere in the Atlantic provinces. Official tradition deemed the first landing site to be at Cape Bonavista, Newfoundland, although other locations are possible. After 1497, Cabot and his son Sebastian Cabot continued to make other voyages to find the Northwest Passage, and other explorers continued to sail out of England to the New World, although the details of these voyages are not well recorded. Based on the Treaty of Tordesillas, the Spanish crown claimed it had territorial rights in the area visited by John Cabot in 1497 and 1498 CE. However, Portuguese explorers like João Fernandes Lavrador would continue to visit the North Atlantic coast, which accounts for the appearance of Labrador on topographical maps of the period. In 1501 and 1502 the Courtriel brothers explored Newfoundland and Labrador, claiming these lands as part of the Portuguese Empire. In 1506, King Manuel I of Portugal created taxes for the cod fisheries in Newfoundland waters. João Álvares Fagundes and Pero de Barcelos established fishing outposts in Newfoundland and Nova Scotia around 1521 CE. However, these were later abandoned, with the Portuguese colonizers focusing their efforts on South America. The extent and nature of Portuguese activity on the Canadian mainland during the 16th century remains unclear and controversial. English America, New France and colonization 1534 to 1763. French interest in the New World began with Francis I of France, who in 1524 sponsored Giovanni da Verrazzano to navigate the region between Florida and Newfoundland in hopes of finding a route to the Pacific Ocean. In 1534, Jacques Cartier planted a cross in the Gaspe Peninsula and claimed the land in the name of Francis I. Earlier colonization attempts by Cartier at Charlesbourg Royal in 1541, at Sable Island in 1598 by Marquis de la Roche-Mesgoas, and at Dorset, Quebec in 1600 by François Gravé du Pont had failed. Despite these initial failures, French fishing fleets began to sail to the Atlantic coast and into the St. Lawrence River, trading and making alliances with First Nations. In 1604, a North American fur trade monopoly was granted to Pierre Duguay Sieur de Mons. The fur trade became one of the main economic ventures in North America. Duguay led his first colonization expedition to an island located near the mouth of the St. Croix River. Among his lieutenants was a geographer named Samuel de Champlain, who promptly carried out a major exploration of the northeastern coastline of what is now the United States. In the spring of 1605, under Samuel de Champlain, the new St. Croix settlement was moved to Port Royal. In 1608, Champlain founded what is now Quebec City, one of the earliest permanent settlements, which would become the capital of New France. He took personal administration over the city and its affairs, and sent out expeditions to explore the interior. Champlain himself discovered Lake Champlain in 1609. By 1615, he had traveled by canoe up the Ottawa River through Lake Nipissing and Georgian Bay to the center of Huron country near Lake Simcoe. During these voyages, Champlain aided the Wendat in the battles against the Iroquois Confederacy. As a result, the Iroquois would become enemies of the French and be involved in multiple conflicts until the signing of the Great Peace of Montreal in 1701. The English, led by Humphrey Gilbert, had claimed St. John's, Newfoundland, in 1583 as the first North American English colony by royal prerogative of Queen Elizabeth I. In the reign of King James I, the English established additional colonies in Cupid's and Ferryland, Newfoundland, and soon after established the first successful permanent settlements of Virginia to the south. On September 29, 1621, a charter for the foundation of a New World Scottish colony was granted by King James to Sir William Alexander. In 1622, the first settlers left Scotland. They initially failed and permanent Nova Scotian settlements were not firmly established until 1629 during the end of the Anglo-French War. These colonies did not last long. In 1630, 1631, under Charles I of England, the Treaty of Suza was signed, ending the war and returning Nova Scotia to the French. New France was not fully restored to French rule until the 1632 Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye. This led to new French immigrants and the founding of Trois-Rivières in 1634. During this period, in contrast to the higher density and slower-moving agricultural settlement development by the English inward from the east coast of the colonies, New France's interior frontier would eventually cover an immense area with a thin network centered on fur trade, conversion efforts by missionaries, establishing and claiming an empire, and military efforts to protect and further those efforts. The largest of these canoe networks covered much of present-day Canada and central present-day United States. After Champlain's death in 1635, the Roman Catholic Church and the Jesuit establishment became the most dominant force in New France and hoped to establish a utopian European and Aboriginal Christian community. In 1642, the Sulpicians sponsored a group of settlers led by Paul Chomedy de Maisonneuve, who founded Ville-Marie, precursor to present-day Montreal. In 1663 the French crown took direct control of the colonies from the Company of New France. Although immigration rates to New France remained very low under direct French control, most of the new arrivals were farmers, and the rate of population growth among the settlers themselves had been very high. The women had about 30% more children than comparable women who remained in France. Yves Landry says Canadians had an exceptional diet for that time. This was due to the natural abundance of meat, fish, and pure water, the good food conservation conditions during the winter, and an adequate wheat supply in most years. The 1666 Census of New France was conducted by France's intendant, Jean Talon, in the winter of 1665 to 1666. The census showed a population count of 3,215 Acadians inhabitants in the administrative districts of Acadia and Canada. The census also revealed a great difference in the number of men at 2,034 versus 1,181 women. Wars during the colonial era. By the early 1700s, the New France settlers were well established along the shores of the St. Lawrence River and parts of Nova Scotia, with a population around 16,000. However, new arrivals stopped coming from France in the preceding decades, resulting in the English and Scottish settlers in Newfoundland, Nova Scotia, and the southern 13 colonies to vastly outnumber the French population, approximately 10 to 1 by the 1750s. From 1670, through the Hudson's Bay Company, the English also laid claim to Hudson Bay and its drainage basin known as Rupert's Land, establishing new trading posts and forts, while continued to operate fishing settlements in Newfoundland. French expansion along the Canadian canoe routes challenged the Hudson's Bay Company claims, and in 1686, Pierre Troyes led an overland expedition from Montreal to the shore of the bay, where they managed to capture a handful of outposts. La Salle's explorations gave France a claim to the Mississippi River Valley, where fur trappers and a few settlers set up scattered forts and settlements. There were 4 French and Indian wars and 2 additional wars in Acadia and Nova Scotia between the 13 American colonies and New France from 1688 to 1763. During King William's War, military conflicts in Acadia included Battle of Port Royal, a naval battle in the Bay of Fundy, and the raid on Chignecto. The Treaty of Ryswick in 1697 ended the war between the two colonial powers of England and France for a brief time. During Queen Anne's War, the British conquest of Acadia occurred in 1710, resulting in Nova Scotia, other than Cape Breton, Breton, being officially ceded to the British by the Treaty of Utrecht, including Rupert's Land, which France had conquered in the late 17th century. As an immediate result of this setback, France founded the powerful fortress of Louisbourg on Cape Breton Island. Louisbourg was intended to serve as a year-round military and naval base for France's remaining North American empire and to protect the entrance to the St. Lawrence River. Father Rail's War resulted in both the fall of New France's influence in present-day Maine and the British recognition of having to negotiate with the MIKMAQ in Nova Scotia. During King George's War, an army of New Englanders led by William Pepperell mounted an expedition of 90 vessels and 4,000 men against Louisbourg in 1745. Within 3 months the fortress surrendered. The return of Louisbourg to French control by the peace treaty prompted the British to found Halifax in 1749 under Edward Cornwallis. Despite the official cessation of war between the British and French empires with the Treaty of Aix-la-Chapelle, the conflict in Acadia and Nova Scotia continued on as the Father Le Loutre's War. The British ordered the Acadians expelled from the lands in 1755 during the French and Indian War. An event called the Expulsion of the Acadians in a grand derangement. The expulsion resulted in approximately 12,000 Acadians being shipped to destinations throughout Britain's North American and to France, Quebec and the French Caribbean colony of Saint-Domingue. The first wave of the expulsion of the Acadians began with the Bay of Fundy campaign, and the second wave began after the final siege of Louisbourg. Many of the Acadians settled in southern Louisiana, creating the Cajun culture there. Some Acadians managed to hide and others eventually returned to Nova Scotia, but they were far outnumbered by new migration of New England planters who were settled on the former lands of the Acadians and transformed Nova Scotia from a colony of occupation for the British to a settled colony with stronger ties to New England. Britain eventually gained control of Quebec City and Montreal after the Battle of the Plains of Abraham and Battle of Fort Niagara in 1759, and the Battle of the Thousand Islands and Battle of St. Foy in 1760.